Okay, thank you everyone. My name is Deon. I'm the director of the research group here at the World Bank. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural International Seminar on Trade. I keep wanting to say conference or something after that. So we're very happy to have you here at the World Bank. So the ISoT was born from a collaboration across a number of institutions and all committed to rigorous policy relevant research. So the partners are the Journal of International Economics, the Banque de France, the Center for Economic Policy Research, the University of Surrey, and us here at the World Bank. So let me start by thanking these partner institutions for this close and ongoing collaboration. And then also especially to the teams who worked obviously behind the scenes to make this conference possible. So we're really delighted to host such a great gathering of scholars. And the presentations, as you'll see over the next day and two, span work on trade and firm behavior, labor markets, equity, finance, transport bottlenecks, digital regulation, and political economy. So a wide range of topics. This year's program is the result of an extremely competitive selection process. There were over 200 paper submissions, clearly a reflection of the vibrancy of trade research and its policy relevance, and I don't think we really need to make the case for the policy relevance given the times we're living in. What unites the papers that were submitted, and especially the ones that were accepted into the program, is the focus on using the most rigorous empirical and quantitative work to understand how trade functions obviously in this changing world. Each of the sessions we're going to have offer analytical depth and tools, importantly, for thinking about how policy can respond to changing environments. Of course, as I've intimated, this is especially important at this moment when the global trade architecture is under stress from geopolitical tensions, industrial policy shifts, and rapid technological change. Many of the forces reshaping trade today also challenge long-standing assumptions in the field, which is why a combination of theory, data, and quantitative tools on display here is so critical. Of course, policymakers, and with the World Bank we care a lot about the policymakers here, must navigate this external environment marked by shifting rules, contested norms, and increasingly regionalized value chains, while still trying to use trade as a lever for inclusive growth. Evidence-based guidance that come out of events such as this are essential to them, but this guidance must be grounded in frameworks that reflect today's realities and not sort of hypothetical situations in the past. At the World Bank, as I mentioned, we're particularly focused on what this all means for developing countries, how they can adapt, compete, and succeed in an increasingly fragmented and complex trade environment. We're proud to support research that sheds light on these questions, and it's a pleasure to see so many colleagues here from the Development Research Group, and of course from the broader international research and policy communities actively contributing to these important debates. I should say, we've actually gathered a lot of our work on trade here in the Development Research Group under a research program called Trade Fragmentation, and we're building out a website that you can find through our landing page that pulls together a number of the different strands on this work. We hope that this International Seminar on Trade becomes not just an annual touch point for new ideas in international trade, but also a platform for collaboration among institutions, disciplines, and between research and policy. So of course, I can't wrap up without thanking all the people who made today's conference and the associated special issue of the Journal of International Economics come together. As you'll see from this long list of names I'm going to mention, pulling off an event like this is no small feat. So from the World Bank side, heartfelt thanks to Ryan Hahn, Daria Janulaite, sorry, apologies for the pronunciation, Lubna Enadir, Claudia Rivas Rios, Erhan Artuk, and Daria Taglioni. Special thanks also to Bao Can Lee from the CEPR. From the Journal of International Economics, we're especially grateful to Costas, Arkolakis, Gianmarco Ottaviano and John Vogel, as well as the editors of the special issue, Laura Alfaro, who also kindly agreed to be our keynote speaker, and Steve Redding. And finally, a warm thank you to our partners, Juan Carluccio, Agnès Benassi, and Lionel Fontanier from Banque de France, Beata Jaborczyk from CEPR, and Holger Breinlich from the University of Surrey, and apologies for the pronunciation of the various names. Thank you again for joining us here today, and I wish you a productive and engaging seminar. And over to Costas.
Thanks, Deon. Pleasure to be here, and I want to also thank the World Bank, the teams of the World Bank, the Banque de France, the CEPR, the University of Surrey, and the JA team, for this incredible collaboration. It has been very, very rewarding for me to work with all of you, kind of putting this together literally from scratch to something that we will be kind of planning for every year for the foreseeable future. And it has been something that Martin, Ruben, and I, since we stepped in the JIE, were thinking about how to do for years, but it was not such a simple thing to do, because we want to create some lasting institution, not just kind of something that will last a special issue or something. And I think we have the right partners to do that, and I'm very, very happy to be here starting this. So this June actually will be the 48th year of the International Seminar on Macro, which is one of the more lasting institutions in our profession. From kind of the macro side. So I think we should aim to make sure this works at least for the next 47 years to kind of catch up. I want to especially thank, of course, the World Bank team, all the people you mentioned, for organizing this year. I know it was a lot of work, and I'm sorry if it was, much extra work, because it was the first time we do it. And I'm very much looking forward next year to be in France, the team of the Banque de France. Thanks, everyone.
So I think with that, we're going to roll right into the first session, right? Okay, we have two papers, supply chain disruptions, pass-through and firm heterogeneity, and the second paper is trade liberalization, wage rigidity, and labor market dynamics with heterogeneous firms. Thanks.
May I call the speakers to the table, I guess, or the first speaker, as you wish. It doesn't matter. So I guess you here because you will be standing, right? And then Discussant, you can sit where, and you are at the second paper. You can decide whether you want to sit here or there. Okay, perfect. Okay. So, let me see. Sorry, we are, as you see, we are still getting. Maybe just the speaker and the discussant, or whatever. Whatever do you prefer?
It might be easier for me.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Okay. Okay, so you have 40 minutes.
40 minutes, yeah. All right, and let me see, does the clicker work on? Cool. All right, so 40 minutes. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for including our paper in the program. We're really excited. This is basically fresh off the press. So we are looking really forward to seeing what you guys' reactions to this paper is. This is called The Price of Delays, Supply Chain Disruptions and Pricing Dynamics. It's joint work with Salomé Baslandze, who is also in the audience. And the usual disclaimers apply. We are both at the Atlanta Fed, so Federal Reserve disclaimers. The motivation is relatively straightforward. So supply chain disruptions surged in 2020 through 2023 as we experienced at the same time record inflation. So if you are, well, if you were reading sort of like the newspaper, or it's probably fine. Can everyone hear me?
It's
for the web?
registration. Yeah.
Okay.
Let me see.
Okay, so.
Try to see if.
No, doesn't seem.
I'm not a good host, apparently.
Okay. Does this work? Okay, great. if you are based in a policy-oriented institution, or if you were reading a newspaper at the time, you would probably have seen a graph that looks a bit similar to this one. What we're plotting here is the CPI inflation series. Pretty standard. It's going to be X food energy. So we're going to be focusing on goods here. And we're also plotting what is the global supply chain pressure index that the New York Fed released. This is basically a diffusion index that is capturing a lot of disaggregated data about transportation pressures, lead times, and so on. And it's giving you a sort of representative imagery of what the supply chain pressures were that we experienced at the time. And I think the sort of like easy takeaway that people had were looking at this was that supply chain pressures were an important driver or component of the underlying record inflation. When we looked at this, we thought like, well, this is interesting, but it's sort of way too aggregate in flavor. And there's a problem with looking at aggregate data like this, and the problem is twofold. One is that the aggregate series conflates very different shocks. So if you're thinking about supply chain shocks, and if you're looking up what the New York Fed sort of kind of like bundles into that, it's freight cost, it's transportation costs, it's potentially dwell times at ports that you're thinking about, it's lead times that are increasing. And they're conceptually, certainly from a theory perspective, very different in terms of how the firm is responding to these pressures, but they're also conceptually from a policymaker point of view, very different shocks. So you want to think about them not in terms of one aggregate series, but you want to think about them potentially in terms of different shocks that are being fed into the system, into the firm's problem. The other thing that is also very problematic is that it's an aggregate data series that is reflecting an equilibrium outcome of a very particular equilibrium, where both cost shocks, delay shocks, and demand shocks were all interacting together with firms that were strategically interacting in certain submarkets. And at the end of the day, this is not particularly helpful for us. We want to decompose that. We want to have a more narrow micro level idea of what the different shocks are and how they're interacting with market composition and strategic interactions. So our starting point is that there seemed to be very little micro evidence on the pass-through of delay shocks, and also we have more evidence on cost shocks, but in this particular exam, this particular time period of the pass-through of delay shocks into prices and the strategic spillovers on this kind of like delay margin. And we started by, this is basically the rest of this presentation, this is going to be a somewhat heroic exercise where we're thinking about merging firm-level shipment data, import data, extremely disaggregated. It's going to be the universe of US imports with an asterisk. And we're going to merge that against consumer prices. So the actual prices that consumers are facing in stores, in retail stores during that period. And what this then allows us to match sort of kind of like what is happening on the import side against the pass-through into consumer prices. So we're estimating the pass-through of delay shocks and cost shocks, and we're also going to be looking at competitor amplification via strategic spillovers. And at the end of the day, this is going to be a quantification exercise where we're then looking at how do price pressures and price dynamics decompose into these underlying margins. So what this paper does, I'm going to be a bit sort of like umbrella overview. First, on the theory side, there's going to be a framework. It's going to be more detailed in the paper than it is today in the presentation. But the underlying idea is that the firm is facing a joint inventory pricing problem. So the firm is not just setting prices, but it's also potentially facing an inventory management problem where they're having stochastic imported, where they're having imported quantities that are potentially subject to stochastic delays. And what this means is that the firm has an incentive to adjust the price in order to avoid stocking out. So now the pricing is not just, revenue maximization, profit maximization tool. It's also going to be a tool in order to manage the demand pressure that's being exerted on your existing inventory, and where you want to adjust the price in order to manage these delay-driven stock outs that might be occurring in equilibrium. There's going to be a pricing equation that comes out of this where delays and cost changes are going to feed into the endogenous price that the firm is setting, and where this is also subject to strategic interactions on both margins. We're going to show you a novel microdata set where we matched, as I said before, monthly firm product prices and import shortfalls. So delays are not directly observable, but we're going to argue that import shortfalls, which is the moving average sort of like import vis-a-vis the pre-pandemic baseline, is going to be an important proxy for delivery delays. And we're going to also feed into this additional data for the instrumental variables that I'm going to be talking about later. Using these different IVs, we're going to estimate the delay pass-through, the cost pass-through via shift share IVs. So we're going to have different exposure to different aggregate trends in terms of these different push variables, as well as the strategic interactions. And at the end of the day, there's going to be a little quantification exercise where we show that the model is going to give us sort of like an equation for the change in the equilibrium prices given the cost and delay shocks and the strategic interactions. And we're going to be able to decompose these different margins given the shock series that we're seeing. So let me jump right into it. First, I'm going to be talking about the theory to kind of like create a common sort of like framework on how we are thinking about this and to build up the estimating equation. And then I'm going to be talking about more data, empirics, and the quantification. Theory, relatively straightforward. Here, just the overview, is going to be a simple inventory pricing problem for the monopolist. The markup is going to depend not just on your demand elasticity, that might be variable and firm specific. Firm is going to be I here, but it's also going to depend on the stock in elasticity. Effectively, how much pressure is additional demand going to exert on your product availability. So the firm is going to take that account when it's setting its markup and setting its prices. Pricing and inventory decisions are also going to be subject to strategic interactions, and we're going to be able to capture competitor behavior with appropriate price and delay indices. So just as a warm-up, remember your introductory microeconomics class. This is just a fixed notation. So think about the simple monopolist pricing problem. There's going to be a monopolist. He's setting prices to maximize profits here, which is revenue minus the total cost. The lower cap variables are going to be log variables. Revenue is given by price times quantity. Quantity is responsive towards the price that the firm is setting, and the total cost is dependent on how much the firm is producing or procuring. So on the right-hand side, you see the standards of like monopoly introductory microeconomics graph for the price setting of the monopolist. Then we're doing a little twist on this one, which is that assume now that there's going to be a two-dimensional problem. There's going to be the firm is going to set prices and it's going to set an inventory choice. The inventory policy is going to be denoted by tau star here. There's more detail in the paper. Right now, just assume that it has been optimally chosen in sort of like a second stage. And we're going to be focusing in on the pricing problem. So given this tau I, this inventory policy, the firm is now going to maximize the availability adjusted profit. The way to think about this is imagine a firm over a cycle starts with some inventory level, puts in the delivery, an order for additional deliveries. That order might derive subject to delays. If it's delayed, the firm might actually stock out over that cycle. If it's stocking out, that is going to reduce the effective revenue it's going to capture over that cycle, which is going to adjust the marginal revenue downwards by this S function. And this S function is then the availability function. It's going to depend on the demand pressure. So if the firm is setting a lower price, that means more consumers are arriving. More consumers are arriving over the cycle means that the firm is more likely to stock out over the cycle. It reduces the effective revenue that the firm is getting out of the cycle. It can increase the availability by ordering more, but at some point there's going to be an ordering cost, which means that the tau is going to be somewhat prohibitive at some point, and it can experience shocks. And the shocks is going to be the psi parameter here, the last one here, which is going to potentially tighten the supply and tighten the inventory problem. So at the end of the day, what does this do to the pricing problem? You can see it on the right-hand side. It's going to do this proportional shifting downwards, this rotating of the marginal revenue curve, which means that now that the firm is adjusting for the fact that it might be stocking out, it's going to intersect here with the marginal cost curve a bit earlier, and it's going to imply a higher price under the consideration that the firm also now needs to manage with the price, the inventory, and the availability problem. So you can do this in a number of different ways. I don't really have time to kind of like go too deep into inventory models, but you can think about kind of like generalizations where there's depreciations or more dynamic things. Right now, all I want you to think about is that there's a fixed order in the background, sort of like decaying as consumers are coming in, and there could be a stochastic delay that you're experiencing. And that's gonna endogenously in this setting sort of like generate stock outs for the firm, that the firm then in the first stage is solving for by setting an appropriate price given this inventory policy. Cool. So the resulting optimal price that you're getting then in this is it takes the standard form, so it's going to be log marginal cost here, but then the markup formula is a tiny bit different. You're going to have this additional term here, so it's going to be effectively sort of like an effective demand elasticity. Is going to be availability adjusted, and the availability adjustment is going to be how sensitive is this S function with regard to additional demand that you're facing. And this is going to be negative, so it's going to be this downward adjustment of the demand elasticity, which means that at the end of the day, there's going to be a higher markup once the firm takes this into account. So consistent with the picture that you're seeing on the right, if the firm is more likely to stock out over a cycle because it's facing these additional demand pressures, then this means that the firm is going to increase the prices in order to avoid that and manage that problem. Now, how do we think about the effect of a supply shock here? This would be sort of like what we're thinking about happened during the COVID pandemic. There's going to be delivery delays. That's going to put more pressure on this problem. What this effectively means, there's going to be this additional sort of like rotation of this green marginal revenue curve, which means that there's going to be an additional adjustment in the markup via the kappa. That's going to endogenously change, and that's going to put additional pricing pressure on the firm in terms of what we're seeing. We can then built on the excellent work by Amity, Itzkoki, and Konings, and generalize this problem towards strategic interactions. So there's a lot more detail on these propositions in the paper, but at the end of the day, you're starting from an equilibrium where these firms are interacting with each other in terms of prices and inventories that they're setting. So this is not going to be just an individual problem, but there's going to be this vector, this response vector, where the firm is going to be responding towards the prices of the other firms in the same market and the inventory choices of the other firms in the same market. And what you can show is that there's going to be a best response that solves this fixed point problem in equilibrium with some markup functions that are characterizing the optimal response. This is helpful for us, both because it gives us a theoretical founding, but it also helps us to think about price change decompositions. So at the end of the day, what we can derive from this is that there's going to be change in equilibrium, change in the prices. There's going to be pinned down by your own response towards the marginal cost shocks that you're experiencing, but also by your response towards your own inventory changes that you're experiencing too. And you're also going to respond to your competitors' price changes and your competitors' changes in their inventory functions. So it becomes this, normally we would think about interactions in terms of prices only. Now it becomes this interactions along this additional margin, which is that they're playing a game about product availability and potentially endogenously evolving sort of like market structure, where you're responding to the fact that some of these firms might be stocking out, which shifts around your own demand elasticity, in which case you need to adjust your own markup accordingly. So all these different variables are going to pin down your responsiveness to these endogenous variables with regard to the markup function that we characterized before. There's a nice little proposition in the paper that uses envelope theorem results to show that we can measure these competitor effects with market share weighted effects of the observed of the choice variables. Now, to wrap up the theory section, there's one more thing that we need to address, which is, so this is sort of like motivating our reduced form regression. There's one more thing that we need to address, which is delays is a bit theoretical. We cannot really observe delays well in the data. It's a bit problematic. We have some survey data. You can use ISM stuff, but at the end of the day, we don't have a good micro level measure of delays that we can directly use. So what we're going to do, and inventories are similarly problematic from a data observation point of view. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to argue that what is really interesting to look at is import shortfalls versus the pre-pandemic baseline. So there's a bit of an event study flavor. The way that you want to think about this is that there's a normal import schedule that the firm would be doing in a baseline year, and we're going to proxy that with moving averages or cumulative averages. And we're then going to look at the shock period, which is going to be the pandemic period, and we're going to measure to what extent you're falling short in terms of your import schedule vis-a-vis that baseline period. Now, there's going to be a couple of accounting adjustments that you need to make. First of all, imported deliveries are only a subpart of the total deliveries that are feeding into your inventories. So you want to adjust for the average openness of the firm in our different sectors. And you want to also adjust for the fact that total deliveries are feeding into inventories via this optimal choice problem. So at the end of the day, the way that we are doing this, we're going to argue shortfalls are going to measure with this measure here, the relative decline as we are experiencing supply chain shocks. And we're going to calibrate the input share in our data. And we're going to interpret our coefficients to be the reduced form effect then of deliveries onto inventories, inventories onto the stock and elasticity, and then stock and elasticity onto the markup. So that's going to be our theoretically consistent interpretation of the coefficient that we're estimating. Okay. So that was my short, maybe somewhat quick overview of the theory. Now let me go towards the part that we're really, really excited about, which is the data construction. So we have a new data set that links prices, consumer prices. Typically, I think a lot of the literature would be working with import prices. We see directly consumer prices in the store level, and we have shipments of US importers. So I'm going to talk a bit about the price dynamics from this consumer panel, the shortfalls from the BOL data, and I'm also going to talk a bit about the other two data sets that we're using in order to construct instruments. Now, the first one, which is probably the more novel one for this crowd in particular, is going to be the numerator data. Numerator, you can think about to first order as a Nielsen plus sort of data set. It's a consumer panel. It's a company that effectively has an app out. You can download the app on your iPhone. I think it's called Piggy Bank. I always forget the name. Effectively, what it does, it allows people to digitize their receipts, and they're getting financial or shopping incentive and discount codes and coupons when they're doing that. What is happening then is the company takes these digitized receipts and they are OCRing the receipts, and they're getting from that, so I've done this for more than 1 billion receipts, they're getting from that detailed information about the purchases, the product, the type of product that is being consumed, and they're then refining that in order to get a really nice data set about purchases, quantities, prices, unit prices at the product level, and enriching it with additional information about the firm, brand, and category that the product belongs to. They have that for 2.5 million users. Not all of the users are consistently digitizing receipts. So they have a static sample that we are more consistently working with, where you have a subset of households that are demographically weighted to represent sort of like what we're seeing in the CPI data, of 400,000 households that are consistently digitizing their receipts. And from this, we are constructing the monthly median product level prices within product changes to narrowly get our idea of how consumer prices are changing throughout this period. There's a bunch of asterisks and validation steps that you can do around here. I should probably say that, of course, the data collection is a tiny bit biased. If you're thinking about who is going to opt into this app usage, it's not going to be, you know, the perfectly representative household of the US economy. But what they can do is the demographic reweighting, because they have a lot of different users for which they're soliciting the demographics via surveys in the data. And what is interesting is that if you're then kind of like looking what this implies, so this is like one quick validation thing that you might be interested in, we can construct a CPI equivalent measure from that data set. So what we have here is in green is CPI, in blue is CPI commodity, and in red is going to be our numerator implied CPI index. And we're pretty comfortable with how it is at least sort of like mirroring the inflation trajectory that we're seeing in this data. But happy to talk more about validation and potential concerns that you have offline. The second data set that we're going to be using is your shipments data. So you might be a bit more familiar with this. This is Panjiva bill of lading data. What it effectively is, there's going to be, you know, the US authorities are dropping. So this is a logistical document that any shipper that wants to import into the US needs to file with US authorities. At the end of the day, this is going to contain quantity data, shipper and consignee data, plus some location information, imputed HS categories. There's a bit of this is done via OCR, so you want to be a tiny bit careful about these imputations. And at the end of the day, it gives us a relatively big pictures of like real-time imagery of what US imports look like, but there, as Aaron has pointed out in a previous write-up, there are some issues with redaction where you want to be a tiny bit careful about the aggregate representativeness of this data series. It's not exactly how we're using the data in any case. We're going to be using firm-level heterogeneity, but we do want to be mindful about potential selection issues that one might be concerned about here. But in general, it's the best, outside of the census, it's the best data set that we can use in order to match against this other privately outside of census available data set. And therefore, it's the best way forward if you want to do micro-level analysis, outside of lifted. Though lifted is always greater. In any case, what we're constructing here is going to be these import delivery shortfalls. The way that we are doing this is we are borrowing a tiny bit from the firm dynamics and firm empirics literature. We are using these Davis-Hartiwanger shoe measures. We're going to construct first moving averages of imports at the firm level. So we don't just want to have sort of like your spot sort of like import level. We want to have more of a smooth notion of what your import trajectory is in order to match it a bit better against sort of like the OR implied inventory management problem. So we're going to have these K-week moving averages of import volumes in a 2019 baseline and the remaining sample. And what we're going to construct is these growth rates vis-a-vis the 2019 baseline, but we're going to do one little trick, which is that in the denominator, we're allowing for both the baseline and the shifted period. This means that you're also tracing out the extensive margin effects, which is a common trick that is employed in the firm dynamics literature. So you don't just want to construct this conditional on there being a non-zero observation. We want to construct this for a conditional on there being any observation in a sample, so we are also having the extensive margin effects. And then this is normalized by 2. So this is going to be a measure that's going to be bounded between -2 and +2. So this is going to give us this idea of, I'm going to get to it. Just 1 second. So it's going to be the consignee ID. And we're going to match that against the firm brand name in the numerator data. I'm going to talk about it in a second. Sorry. And then we're going to take these, we're going to do this at the HS2 specific level. So for each firm, we're going to do this in a disaggregated way at HS2 level. And then we're going to aggregate this up with baseline shares into a overall delivery shortfall measure at the firm level. In order to and this is the data series that results from this. You can see this for 2, 3, and 6 month moving averages. We are pretty happy with this in the sense that it captures nicely the sort of like the pressure, the delays that we're seeing in the 2020 period, and then the resulting recovery that we're seeing in 21 and 2022. Okay, and then sort of like the reversion back towards trading off what we are experiencing right now, which is not much pressure at all. The merge data, what we're doing there is that we are using Panjiva consignee names. There's an additional discussion that one could have here about the accuracy of this, but we're pretty happy with, and we're merging it against the numerator manufacturers and brand names. This gives us firm month specific shortfalls and price changes, and we cover about 1/3 of the firms and products that we're seeing in the numerator data, or about 50% of the sales that we've constructed. So we're pretty happy with that match quality. There's going to be a couple of stylized facts that I don't really have time to talk about too much, but just to mention, there's a large, of course, there's a large heterogeneity in terms of price setting. We know that from the pricing literature, but there's also a large amount of heterogeneity in terms of these import shortfalls. So to some extent, if you're looking at these sort of like aggregate time series, it's going to hide a lot of the micro heterogeneity that there's also going to be an interesting story where some firms are affected by these delivery shortfalls and other firms are not. And that exists at the product group level, at the firm level. We also want to highlight that price increases are somewhat larger for bigger firms in the raw data, and price increases are smaller for firms with more diversified supply chains, just as a stylized fact. All right, then we also gonna loop in some additional data to construct some additional instruments. The idea here is that we're gonna leverage this data to get additional exogeneity, the additional exogenous variation on the delivery delay, and additional exogenous variation on the marginal cost component. So for the delay measure, we're going to be using previous data that Wan Fong and I have constructed in our research on transportation, where we've collected vessel location data, AIS data, where we've measured the overall time that ships are spending in ports. That's called the dwell time. It's a common measure to think about port efficiency. It gives you an idea of how long does it take, for example, the Port of LA to turn around a 15,000 TEU container ship and bring it back onto the oceans for its next journey. We've seen in this data that this has massively increased in a very heterogeneous way during the pandemic, especially during the second bit of the pandemic, the 2021 and 2022 period. And we can use that in a port-specific, we constructed this in a port-specific way in order to measure the exposure of individual firms, depending on their transportation sort of like pattern, towards these port-specific increases in their congestion. The second thing that we are doing is we are constructing import unit costs across HS2 codes from the US trade online data. Is relatively straightforward. We want to have an idea of how the import unit value changes, and we're going to think about this as an additional marginal cost shock. The last thing that we're doing, which is a bit more novel, I'm actually surprised that people haven't looked much more into this, is that we are also constructing the freight code. This is coming from the port district level US trade online data, the freight cost at the US port level. So basically what we're doing is we're doing ratios, CIF over FOB values. That's going to give you the implied freight and insurance cost for each unit of trade that you're shipping. And it's going to be a really good measure of port-specific freight costs. And you can even disaggregate it further if you're interested. A tiny little bit of a remark. Sometimes you see these papers, especially in policy circuits, where they're using sort of like the freight wave, kind of like freight cost indices, the spot prices. They are poor measures of what the freight costs actually were, of how they were being realized during that period. Why? Because the spot market is only 30% of the aggregates of like ocean shipping market. You want to think about these measures are more correct measures because they're also integrating the contractual measures. And if you, for the little evidence that we have on the sort of like relationship specific contractual measures, they have very different dynamics, and they were not quite as crazy in terms of their variance as the spot prices. So you want to be careful, and we think that this is the appropriate one to put into our analysis. All right, so with that being said, we are turning now towards the empirics. The idea is now to estimate the pass-throughs of cost shocks and delay shocks in this setting. First, we're going to start with the own pass-through equation. On the left-hand side, we're going to have at the product level and the firm level and the month level the price changes. And on the right-hand side, we're going to have our delivery shortfall measure and our different measures of marginal cost components. So this can be our firm import unit cost and our freight cost. The coefficient of interest is the own shortfall elasticity and the cost pass-through elasticity beta and gamma, and we can include the firm fixed effect in order to difference out the cross-sectional variation in price setting and price dynamics across firms. This one is going to be really important, and I'm going to talk about this in a second. We're going to include product category quarter fixed effects. So at this point, you might be like, okay, fine, interesting data, maybe, and interesting measures that you're constructing, but clearly kind of like shortfalls, they're kind of like capturing these import growth rates. They're going to be endogenous. They're also going to capture demand shocks. Our argument is the following. So obviously, demand shocks, if they're occurring, they're going to drive both price increases and import trajectories, right? So if you're thinking about, well, like everyone wants to have a peloton is going to take this into account. They're going to jack up their prices, and they're going to accelerate the import schedule at the same time. That's going to be measured even in our shortfall series. So in a different way, firms adjust shipments in anticipation of price moves. There's a simultaneity problem. The way that we think about this is that we have these disaggregated import shortfall measures where we're going to construct instruments, IVs, where we're going to think about shift share exposure towards different sort of like aggregate shifts in these measures, but where we're crucially saying, okay, different firms now have different sourcing patterns, different exposures to different freight costs or different delay measures. And we're going to say like, but we can do these comparisons within very narrow product market time time segments of the data. So even if you're kind of like in the fitness equipment sort of like segment of our consumer data, that's what our consumer data buys us, you can then compare different firms within that narrow segment that are all kind of like experiencing the COVID kind of like home fitness demand shock, and you can compare different firms that have different sourcing patterns in the pre-period. The way that we are constructing these instruments is then relatively classic. It's going to be shift share instruments with pre-pandemic baselines. So we're going to have shortfall exposure. This is going to be delivery shortfall exposure combined external HS2 specific shifts with the firm's 2019 import shares. And we're going to do port dwell time exposure also, where we're going to say different firms are importing from different ports. So you might be on the West Coast, you might be more exposed towards LA and Long Beach, Los Angeles and Long Beach port specifics of like dwell time dynamics compared to an East Coast firm. And but you still might be within the narrowly kind of like the same product market sector. So we're going to compare the two of you because one of you is going to be exposed towards the very dramatic increase in dwell time at the Los Angeles port, and the other one is going to be slightly better in terms of being able to import via the East Coast ports, which were less congested during the time. So the idea here is, again, pre-pandemic baseline shares across the shifts of dwell time across the different US port districts. We're also going to use marginal cost changes. So there's going to be a freight cost measure and a unit cost measure that is going to be exactly using the data that I've shown before. For the freight cost measure, we're going to use the exposure towards individual ports. Again, same baseline measure. And there's going to be freight cost specific, port specific freight cost dynamics that we're seeing in the US customs data. And the second thing that we have is the unit cost dynamics. So this is going to be different exposure towards different HS2 categories in the baseline and the unit cost trajectory throughout the sample. This is our baseline result. As you can see, the OLS, not much going on. This is going to be the upward bias that we're seeing in particular towards in the shortfall series. So as I said, the endogeneity, the simultaneity of demand shocks and the import schedule is going to bring that coefficient up. Once we're looking at introducing the shift shares and the IVs, this is going to bring the coefficient down, and we're going to get economically and statistically significant effects on the shortfall measure. There's going to be additional measures that there's going to be also the own kind of like cost component effects that we're having here, where the increase in unit cost and freight cost is also significantly going to drive the price dynamics during that period. And we don't have a weak IV problem in the setting, so the weak IVs are pretty the F-stats are pretty high. The last thing that we're doing is we're also controlling for serial correlation by introducing some lags that brings up the coefficient on the shortfall a tiny bit. So there's definitely something that you want to do in that regression. Price of a product of a firm, and then at the firm level, we are matching in the shortfalls, at the freight cost, and the unit cost measures. Yeah, exactly. We're averaging over like different products, but then we can control for and this is the important part, the category quarter fixed effect in order to control for demand shocks that are common across products within the same narrow market. Yeah. Sorry, didn't want to be too quick on that. The second thing that you can do is you can look over different horizons of delivery shortfalls. As I said, we are constructing these as moving averages. And you might be asking, well, what's the correct way of kind of like picking that number and what are the dynamic effects? And what we're seeing is that, yes, the dynamic effects are sort of like accumulating over different time horizons. That is also consistent with how you might think about sort of like the pricing problem in the background. So if you're thinking about like standard Calvo pricing problems where not every firm is adjusting at once, there might be some pass-through effect that is cumulative over larger time horizons. Finally, we also want to look into strategic interactions. We think this is a really important margin. Why? Because, you know, importing firms, sure, they're going to adjust towards the the inventory kind of like schedule that they're facing, but also marginal cost shocks that they're facing. But then there's also importing and not importing firms that are endogenously responding to how their market structure is evolving. So imagine you're now in the middle of COVID, a lot of your competitors are facing shortfalls in terms of the import schedules. They might not have enough product to bring to the market. What is happening is you're endogenously facing a more concentrated market. You're going to have more market power that is being generated by these delivery delays. So we want to think about derived shortfalls, and we also want to think similar to what has been done before. We want to think about the derived cost measures as well. So this is going to be similar to what I've shown you before. It's going to be a market share weighted competitor shortfall, and there's going to be a market share weighted competitor unit and freight cost measure as well. These are the results. First, I want to notice that the own kind of like coefficients are relatively stable to what we've seen in the previous regression, and that brings us confidence that they're not too sensitive towards including additional variables that might be somewhat correlated. The interesting thing then is, of course, that the competitor variables, the exposure variables, the strategic interaction variables, they matter quite a bit. They're all economically significant. Right now, the shortfall measure is not statistically significant. We have a hunch of what is happening there. The identification is also getting a tiny bit weaker. It's still relatively robust, but we still might need to do a tiny bit more work in constructing a tiny bit more of a robust measure. But across the board, you're seeing competitor effects on the cost margin, and also hopefully at some point economically significant effects on the shortfall margin. All right, now let me turn towards, in my last 5 minutes, towards the aggregate implications of what I've told you so far. Okay, so from the model, what we can do, effectively the model is a linearized sort of like changes of prices around the initial equilibrium. So we have a system of linear equations. We can solve that system of linear equations to come up with the new equilibrium prices if we are shocking that initial equilibrium with delay shocks and marginal cost shocks. Okay, and the way that we can do this is that we then have the own cost component, the own delay component, spillovers across the delay part, and we then have the strategic interaction that is happening in the product market space. Because as I'm experiencing delay shocks, I'm going to adjust my prices. As I'm adjusting my prices, my competitor is going to adjust their prices. As my competitor is adjusting their prices, I'm adjusting my prices too, and so on and so on. If the gamma is smaller than 1, we're going to get a problem that contracts, and we can define what are the own effects and what are the amplified effects once we're thinking about strategic interactions. And this is exactly the data series that I'm going to show you. What we're going to do is we're going to feed in the marginal cost changes and the delivery delay changes that I've shown you before, and we're going to quantify the price dynamics into these different margins, and we're going to quantify what we're getting given the coefficients that we've estimated. So that's this idea here. We're going to decompose into the direct, the amplified cost effect, and the direct and the amplified delay effect in exactly this way. This is what we're getting out of this exercise, which might be a bit heroic, but I think still informative. In green, you have the different delay margins. You want to think about dark is always going to be the own, and then the light green is going to be the strategically amplified one. And we're going to get the same for blue, which is going to be the different cost margins. And, you know, first of all, you can already see the story that I've told you before, which is that the aggregate series might be interesting about supply chain pressures, but it's hiding a lot of heterogeneity, a lot of different mechanisms that played out in very different heterogeneous ways over different time horizons. What we particularly want to emphasize is the fact that in the beginning, a lot of the inflation, almost kind of like compared to the aggregate price changes, was driven by these delay effects and was driven by both the delay, the own, and the amplified delay effects. So about 95% of the price dynamics can be explained by this quick quantification. If we are looking at the later period, 2021 and 2022, what you're seeing is that the cost dynamics are going to pick up much more. And this is really driven by the fact that as sort of like the import demand shocks we're hitting the supply chain constraints in terms of production and also transportation constraints. Freight costs exploded at the same time, and that really drove a lot of these increases in the direct and the amplified cost effect that we're seeing in the data. So in order to summarize, delay channel seems to explain most of the effect that we're seeing in 2020. And after reopening, port congestion also played somewhat of a role over here, but the cost channel contributed most of what we are seeing in the 2021-2022 period. Yeah, for sure. Sorry. So the idea here is we're going to put into this equation, we're going to take our coefficients for alpha and beta. For gamma, we're actually right now calibrating to the 0.5 from the previous literature. For the marginal cost changes, what we're doing is we're putting in the freight cost changes that we have at the firm level, at the individual firm level, and the, yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So I should be careful about this. We're probably going to refine this a tiny bit more to do some structure imputation of actual kind of like shocks that are implied. And we have some ideas on how to use the quantity data that we have in numerator data in order to get there. And happy to have more ideas if you have any. Right now, it's a bit of a heroic exercise where we're saying the data series are reflective of the shocks that we're seeing, and we're going to see what they imply in terms of the quantification. So please take everything I'm saying here with a grain of salt. But yeah, so marginal cost series, freight and unit cost series, delivery delay series are going to be our import shortfalls, and are going to be our dwell times at the ports that are going to feed into this. And these are going to be the market shares. The W is a matrix. It's going to be the market shares across the submarkets that we're seeing in the numerator data. And that's it. We're going to use the baseline market shares. So you could do it in a rolling way if you want to kind of like correct for the dynamic substitution effect. But right now we thought we are conservative, so we're taking the baseline shares. Yeah, okay. So in that sense, it's a first order approximation of what is happening to the perturbed equilibrium. No, sorry, and I'm here. So the key takeaway, and Salomé really wants me to emphasize this, this is all really about somewhat heroic, ambitious data construction that we think is incredibly valuable, because we do think that looking at the micro level data is informative and is important as part of this conversation that we're having about supply chain disruptions and price dynamics, and it's probably even more important as we're going into this new, somewhat crazy year. So new micro level evidence for the effect of firm level supply chain disruptions on consumer prices in the 2023 period, and it is framed by a joint inventory pricing models. Our main findings are that the macro data, they conflate all these different shocks, but we can decompose them with some interesting regressions and shift share designs. And the next steps are to refine identification a tiny bit more and to validate the data against composite markups and inventories, and to push a bit harder on the quantification, make that a bit more credible. Right now, it's more kind of like a flavor test for you guys. Okay, thank you so much. Sorry.
Discussion. Sorry, that's you, right?
Yep, that's me.
Okay.
I'll use this mic. Is this mic on?
Should, yeah.
Okay, great, wonderful.
10 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you for inviting me to discuss this very, very ambitious, big paper, if you will, by Salomé and Simon. I thought I wanted to start on a slightly lighter note. I mean, a lot of conferences and seminars that I've been to lately, because of what's been in the news of late, including supply chain disruptions and tariff policy uncertainty, has been a little bit heavy. So I thought I should start with a little bit of a joke about supply chain issues. So about supply chain issues, we hope to have candy next month. And this is a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek joke, because I think it actually serves to illustrate how much this notion of supply chain issues and supply chain disruptions has really stuck in the minds of everyone, and not just us, but also little kids, right? 10 years ago, we have absolutely the kids would have absolutely no context for understanding what a supply chain issue is. But now, because of what we've been through, right, even if I talk about this to my kids over the dinner table, they actually kind of understand, items are not arriving today, right, because there is a supply chain issue, right? So it's very much in the public consciousness, if you will. And it's been because of a slew of supply chain disruption events since the 2010s. We've had Trump 1.0 tariffs, 2.0 tariffs, we have the pandemic, natural disasters, geopolitical events, transportation snafus like the Ever Given getting stuck in a canal. So very clearly there's demand for research-driven insights, right, on how these disruptions are affecting supply chain outcomes like delivery times, output, And in the case of this paper, what they're going to be focusing on is the effect on prices. So what does this paper do, right? Up there, I actually have the old title of the paper, right? So the paper takes on a big question. There's a lot of potential research and policy relevance here. And then what I see is the new thing, the key new thing that they bring to the table, especially, is these novel data sources with a lot of potential in there, the Panjiva bills of lading data, and especially the numerator price data, which seems really, really rich, and which, I think you're one of the first movers to try to tap into this. There are some limitations, so I'll have something to say about that. And because they're interested in pricing outcomes, they want to ground this in a theoretical framework. And so the estimating equation that they're going to be running, it is one that is based on the model of price setting with strategic complementarities from Amidi, Iskoki, and Konings, right? In which, right, they have a very nice model. It's been extended by the authors in this current paper, in which own firm price changes are explained as a function of marginal cost shocks. So that's the MC term there, right? As well as, and this is the extension from Simon and Salomé, these what they call stock-in shifters, right? So these are things that affect, if you will, how much inventories the firm is holding at that point in time. That's the notation for that, as well as the reactions to competitors' prices. But competitors' prices are in turn a function of their marginal cost shocks as well as their stock-in shifters. And so that's why you see these third and fourth arguments here in the price change equation. So you're going to take this relationship, you're going to bring this novel data to try to estimate it, and they're going to come up with some fairly interesting findings, in particular that, there's pass-through, right, of these shocks to prices, but I want to emphasize it's less than complete pass-through, right? So it's not a one-for-one pass-through. So the authors have done a lot in this paper, and they're still trying to refine it, rightly so. And I want to sort of push the authors on sort of three fronts. The first is really to try to sharpen the contribution that you're trying to make in the writing. The second is a little bit of an omnibus point about, highlighting, clarifying, perhaps even addressing some of the potential limitations in the data that you're using, as well as this delivery shortfalls measure that you're proposing. And the third thing, as I've sort of hinted on, is how this all relates back to the trade war tariff pass-through literature that has sort of exploded since 2018, 2019. So let me start with sort of the first point, which is sharpening the contribution. There's actually a lot to parse through, parse through, right, in the title of the paper, as well as even in the first line of the introduction. So that's the old title that you had, right? You have delays, you have supply chain disruptions, you have pass-through, you have firm heterogeneity, you talk about inflation, you talk about joint inventory and pricing decisions. And I think it would be very helpful for the reader, right, to try to help us zoom in a little bit on what you think the main contribution of the exercise is here. Is it something to do with the measurement of delays, right? Is it something to do with the measurement of supply chain disruptions? That would be kind of interesting as a contribution in and of itself. Is it the pass-through estimates that you want us to focus on? Is it on the role of inventories or what you're calling stock-in shifters? Is it about firm heterogeneity, right? After reading through, I'm sort of inclined to think that the main points that you really want us to focus on are points 2 and 3. Why? Well, you talk about delays, but you don't actually measure the delays directly in terms of giving us a headline number of what the average delay has been. You don't actually observe inventories directly, right? So you need us to buy into the measure of delivery shortfalls that you're proposing. And firm heterogeneity, feels a little bit like a phrase that's borrowed from a retained from the original AIK paper. It's not really a main point, I think, here. So sort of thinking about how you package this and how you want us to zoom in on what the key contributions are would be super, super useful. All right, next, data questions. I want to emphasize the data requirements for understanding how these kinds of supply chain shocks might affect prices are actually very high, right? You need data on product level, firm-specific prices, as well as those of your competitors. You need to find a way to credibly measure marginal cost shocks, as well as supply chain disruptions. And indeed, one of the key contributions, I think, of the AIK paper was that they actually had suitably detailed data, Belgium firm level administrative data, that allows them, for example, to measure marginal cost shocks very precisely because they have information not just on imported inputs, but also on domestic input use, right? And so then they can apply that to think about strategic complementarities and firm level pricing. What you have here is slightly less than that gold standard of administrative data. And I think the burden, you need to do a little bit more, right, to convince us, right, that accepting some of the shortcomings of this data is nevertheless worth it because you are going to get a lot of leverage out of pushing forward with the analysis, even with less than perfect data, right? Let me start with the positive. I think like sort of a big strength here is this numerator data, which is what you use to capture prices, right? So these are from actual consumer purchase receipts, both physical and digital. But here I would like you to be a little bit more upfront, at least you were in a little bit better in the presentation, but in the writing, being a little bit more upfront about some of the caveats here. The merge rate with the bills of lading data is about 50%, right? So what's missing? Right, what's unmerged, right? One is left to think that these would be products that tend to be intermediate inputs that households don't actually buy and scan receipts of, or products that might change multiple hands between consignee and the US-based consumer. So being a little bit upfront there would be helpful. What I think is a little bit more worrying is the reliance on bills of lading data for information in particular to construct the marginal cost shifters, right, which is a key right-hand side variable in your regression here. You don't have information on use of domestic inputs. So de facto here, you're either assuming that there's no shock to the cost of domestic inputs, or that if there are such shocks, they're safely going into the error term and orthogonal, right, to everything else on the right-hand side. And that's where I get a little bit worried, right? Because there could be some of these domestic inputs could use further upstream imported inputs, right? And those could be subject to supply chain disruptions as well. You're assuming that imported inputs are a constant common share of unit costs. I think at a minimum, you want to allow for some cross-sectoral heterogeneity in that import intensity. And moreover, right, with the bills of lading data, one key limitation there is that you don't have direct information on prices, right? And so you're sort of inferring unit values from a baseline year in the US Census trade data to get a conversion factor from quantities to prices. In the presence of inflation, I worry whether, you sort of illustrate, this sort of understates the unit value increases over time. To the extent that this is classical measurement error, it's a right-hand side variable, it's attenuating your coefficients, but I'm actually worried that this might be non-classical in nature in terms of like systematic, because it systematically might understate, right, the marginal cost shifters there. The merge rate, it's about 50% with numerator. I think at a minimum, you want to kind of want to reassure us that there's not like systematic selection bias and, a quick check like, are the marginal cost shocks and the import delivery shortfalls, are they systematically different across merged versus unmerged firms, okay? I want to sort of push you a little bit more on the measure of delivery shortfalls, which you would like us to take as a shifter of inventories, if you will. Is 2019 an appropriate, quote unquote, disruption-free benchmark year, right? That was already a year in which the Section 301 tariffs were hitting China. Moreover, this is a growth rate, right? And with a growth rate, there could be secular trends over time that might be due to demand side shifts, population growth, or supply side shifts, or underlying productivity improvements. And perhaps you might want to think about residualizing this data before you sort of apply this measure of delivery shortfalls. Let me skip that last point here because I'm being buzzed, right? And get sort of to the third point, which is what do we learn and how do we reconcile this in particular with the tariff pass-through literature that has reported close to complete pass-through from the US tariffs. What you're finding here is pass-through, but less than complete. And I think there's a little bit that needs to be reconciled there to the extent that some of these supply chain disruptions might be a result of some of the tariffs that we've been seeing in the last 5 to 8 years. How do we reconcile this result? And I think you need to do a little bit more to discuss and help readers relate to this. I have two possibilities, two hypotheses. These are not definitive, but they're possibilities. The first might just be that tariff-induced disruptions are somehow different from other supply chain events, right? So supply chain disruption events, right? Perhaps there's a component of supply chain shocks here that is idiosyncratic to the firm. And if that's the case, right, the firm might be willing to absorb some of the pain. Whereas if you think about tariff-induced disruptions, this is something that in principle hits the entire industry, all firms within the same industry at the same time. And if that's the case, right, it might be the optimal strategic response for all the firms to raise their prices in unison in response to a common shock. So there's that, it could entirely be consistent with a setting with strategic complementarities in pricing. The other possibility is a little bit more mundane, which is that what you're getting here is more medium-term adjustments to the shocks. You're having data that go all the way to 2023, whereas the tariff pass-through literature, as far as I'm aware, has focused on sort of shorter-term responses, 2019 and 2020. So, there's a lot to chew on in this paper. It's a big paper. There's a lot of potential in the research question and in the data that you're using. But once again, I'd like to push the authors to sort of sharpen the contribution on the writing, clarify some potential limitations in the underlying data, and help us relate this back to the broader tariff pass-through literature. Thanks.
So do you want to respond and then we collect a few questions?
Okay. Thank you so much, Davin. I will say I have to apologize to Davin. We were chatting last week, and I promised him both to update the draft soon and to send him the slides soon, and I only sent him the final slides yesterday. So this is more kind of like a reflection of the case that of the fact that this project is very rapidly developing. And I think, Davin, you've done. Thank you so much for your comments. It's going to be incredibly helpful for sharpening the paper. And sorry for the logistical complications, the delivery delay. Okay, so yes, I think we are completely. I think we are very kind of like sympathetic to many of the issues that you raised. Some of it is the fact that some of the data work is sort of like actively in the works, and definitely we are definitely so big picture fully on board with kind of like, sharpening, finding the narrow contribution that we want this paper to make, and sharpening the robustness and also acknowledging where the data limitation is going to be a bit more binding. Let me say a couple of things just as a quick response. So yes, we do agree at the end of the day, this is less than gold standard. We don't have access to census data. I think that should be clear. We do think that at the end of the day, this is an important question. We do want to answer this question in the context of the US data. We do think that this has become an important both policy and research question to be examined. And we think that this particular combination, no matter how flawed maybe the bill of lading data, numerator data can be on some dimensions, is going to give you value added that is going to be incredibly insightful along other dimensions. But yes, passing out along which dimensions it's reliable and along which dimensions we need to do more work is definitely important. In terms of what is still in the works for us, we are actively working on using both the quantity data in the numerator data and CompuStat comparisons in order to validate the data a bit more. Also giving kind of like additional insights into the robustness of the merge and what is being merged and what is not being merged. There's going to be additional information, I think, both in CompuStat and the quantity data and numerator will help us, at least in a proxy way, to control for the size of the firm and the sourcing that they're doing on the international side in order to find appropriate controls there. And just to clarify, there was, I think, one tiny bit of misunderstanding. The unit values, so we were very careful about not using the value imputations of the bill of lading itself. We don't think it's credible at all. The only way that we are using these imputed unit values that are coming from census data is for the baseline weights. For the shifts, we are actually using the census data only, which we think is a much more credible implementation of this. That being said, looking forward to many more conversation about how to tighten this paper up more along the dimensions of which you're pushing us into, which I think is the right direction, and looking forward to more conversations about that. And thank you so much for the discussion.
I just give you the microphone and then we can sit around.
Key from the World Bank here. I really appreciate your paper, really, really rich. Yes, sir. Okay. Xiaolui Qi from World Bank. Really appreciate the paper. I want to follow on Davin's question and perhaps will help you answer his question too. Such a rich data set. Not all industries, not all products are subject to supply chain disruption. And not all products, not all industry are subject to Trump tariff 101. So is there a way for you to do some heterogeneity test? The last part of your research focus on aggregate impact. Can you separate into different industries that are more heavily affected by supply chain disruptions, industries that are more heavily affected by Trump tariff, and see whether those industries that are not affected by supply chain, perhaps those industries that are more concentrated on domestic industry, domestic products, groceries or whatsoever, perhaps there you see lesser of an impact. And those industries that are more with input-output linkages, with imports, we see more supply chain interruption. Do you see bigger impact? So that could help address Davin's question.
Are we collecting first or?
I'll ask. It's
Yeah.
actually somewhat of a related thing.
Cool.
So I was wondering, when you look in the data, how idiosyncratic are the delays or how concentrated they are in a given industry? Because I guess in your empirical thing, you'll include something like an industry time fixed effect, or I didn't quite notice at which level were the fixed effects, but you can imagine a lot of the aggregate disruptions will go into the fixed effect.
Yeah.
And so then I guess you estimate the elasticity from the idiosyncratic stuff and apply it to the aggregate. And like, is there a way to check that when there is an aggregate delay in the industry, it has kind of comparable price effects as the idiosyncratic one? And this is, you know, where the strategic complementarity is met as well, right? The estimates are of the idiosyncratic piece, but you want to extend it to the aggregate one as well.
Hi, Simon. Very good presentation. This is Devaki from World Bank. I'm trying to visualize how you actually a little bit did the merge between the numerator and the bill of lading Panjiva, because in the numerator, there is you merge it by the manufacturer, right? So you can basically speak to a very special type of supply chain disruption where the firm is importing and selling the product at the same time, which is a very useful measure, but I think in some ways a specific type of supply chain disruption. So did you think about somehow mapping the HS with the UPC to get to a broader measure of supply chain disruption? I know that this is not trivial, and I think there are people working on doing this mapping, but I thought that could give you a broader sense of supply chain disruption. Thanks.
Just a couple things I wanted to say. Aaron Flan from the Fed board. I think it'd be useful to kind of highlight that this is also a lot focusing on the import side of supply chain disruptions. There was a lot of other domestic supply chain disruptions during this time. The 2020 Texas freeze, I think, is underappreciated as being just completely messing up the petrochem and plastics market in the United States. And then on your measurement, you know, I was kind of worried about this just baseline relative to 2019. Just because in a lot of the things that you're doing, there were these big demand shocks. Now, some of those are being picked up in some of the things that you're doing, but maybe not in others. And I also would want to distinguish between supply chain disruption and congestion versus delays. So my interpretation of 2020 was that all these firms expected demand to be really low and realized demand was much higher. And so they had kind of a shortfall in just shipments coming in. So there was just delays. And my interpretation was congestion really peaked in the 2021 area where you really got the ships lining up. And so you didn't really see that in 2020 for the most part. And so just disentangling those two things, right, of just a mismatch between demand and supply of availability versus congestion causing things to spike, I think would be useful.
Yes, can I? That would be great. So first, heterogeneity. I think super sympathetic. There's much more heterogeneity analysis that we want to do. There's one kind of like qualitative thing that already comes out of this analysis that I keep forgetting. That comes out, is this on now? Yep. Okay. That comes out of the analysis here already, which is that even if you don't have a direct effect, the strategic complementarities mean that there's going to be this percolation effect through the whole market for you. And I think Aaron and you quickly mentioned it before, like one of the things where we are a bit blind on as policymakers is we're really good at estimating these direct effects, but they're percolating through the whole market structure of the domestic economy, which is also a nice part about your paper at the end of the day, which means that you can have this sort of like propagation that really kind of like matters when you're taking these indirect effects into account. So to some extent, we are already looking at some of this, where even if you're not directly experiencing supply chain disruptions, you're still going to be indirectly affected by the fact that, you know, market structure is sort of like endogenously adjusting. And I think that's a really interesting qualitative insight. But definitely fully on board with much more heterogeneity analysis that we want to do. And I think your suggestions that like splitting the sample in kind of like more or less affected kind of like sectors is really important, which then comes to Alex's point, which is that, you know, at the end of the day, there's an interesting question to what extent this is all driven by sort of like aggregate shocks versus kind of like idiosyncratic shocks. We haven't updated this in a tiny bit, but we do see quite a bit of heterogeneity. I like these graphs a lot. These are these kind of like joy division plots that I call them, these K densities across time. And we see quite a bit of heterogeneity both across firms in terms of the import shortfalls and across HS2 codes, which means that this is not just driven by some aggregate shock. This is driven by a lot of idiosyncratic shocks that are, you know, co-varying with that aggregate shock in a really rich way. And it's not just like mean shifters. There's interesting shapes that are kind of like popping on along the lines, which I think this is really where much of the identification is coming from. So, but digging into that a bit deeper, I think would be incredibly interesting for us. Then, yeah, and if you have any specific suggestions, you know, we definitely want to talk more about this. Then in terms of Devaki, merges HS level, yes, we wanted to do that. It's a bit tricky, and I know that you're also working on the numerator data, so we chat. Is that right? Okay, we should. If you have some more specific ideas about it, we should chat a bit more. It's a pretty heavy data lift, and there's some restrictions, constraints that one needs to take into account, both on the numerator and the Panjiva data. But it would be great to do that merge, and I think it would be incredibly helpful, both what we are doing, but you know, also what you guys at the board are doing. I think it's really interesting. So maybe there's some kind of like sharing of the fixed cost that we might want to do. Finally. Yeah, exactly, Aaron. I totally agree that I think we're a bit blind on the domestic side. It's always a problem in trade and in trade and policy. And right now it's really, really frustrating. I think there's on some dimensions, the comparison between the quantities and sales that we're seeing in the numerator data versus the import schedule is going to be incredibly helpful along those lines. And I'm also super sympathetic to the point that you raised, which also Davin raised, which is we really need to play around with different baselines. Just using the baseline 2019 was like a starting point, but we do need to play around with that. We have done some playing around with that, and with like 2017 through 2019 baselines, it doesn't seem to change things too dramatically, but it definitely has an implication for how you want to think about the measurement. And then in terms of congestion versus shortfall, so it's a bit implicit here. We do have the different data series. I mean, that's sort of like the point about having both the dwell time data series at the port level and having these import shortfalls in terms of the shift share instrument. And we can definitely give you a bit more heterogeneity there in terms of how that developed differently. Certainly in the quantification, it has a very different dynamic, like you're saying. The dwell times early on, they drove much of the search in 2020, in 2021, 2022, in terms to the extent that it was driven by delays, was driven entirely by the port dwell time dynamics. So very, very different, which is, you know, the big point here is we do want to disaggregate this. We do want to do these microdata constructions, even if they're ambitious, because I think they're important and informative. So thank you so much. Happy to chat more.
Okay, and now we go to the second paper, which is trade liberalization, which and labor market dynamics. Let me try to figure that out here. Yeah, that's. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. I'm Katya. I'm going to present this paper, Trade Liberalization, Wage Rigidity, and Labor Market Dynamics with Heterogeneous Firms. This is a paper joined with Elchana Helpman and Olegas Hoki, who's here. Let me start with the motivation. The motivation is that we all know that trade liberalization shocks can have significant effects for the labor market. And for example, Otterdo and Hansen, they document that it results in declining wages, in a lot of displacement of the workers, and prolonged periods of unemployment. And while we can somewhat debate on the aggregate effects of this, there is a rich heterogeneity in the outcomes that's happening in the background. For example, there is a paper by Verhoeven who is documenting that there is a rich heterogeneity in the firm's adjustment that depends on the firm size and their export status following the trade shocks. And when it comes to the workers' outcomes, looking at the firm is also important. So in particular, these two papers, Amiti and Davis and Helpman et al., they look at the wage heterogeneity. They document that firm employment history is at least as important as sector and occupation of the worker for their outcomes following the trade liberalization. So in this paper, we're going to kind of reconcile this, provide the mechanism for this heterogeneity, for these rich patterns of adjustment. It's going to be a theoretical and quantitative analysis of labor market transitions following the trade shocks with the labor market frictions. So we're going to focus on the labor market with search and matching frictions and wage rigidity. We're going to describe these heterogeneous responses of the firms that come out of the aggregate positive shock to the trade, and how those heterogeneity in firms is linked to the heterogeneity in workers' outcomes in this frictional labor market. So then we're going to discuss whether there are any dissipated trade gains from trade that are coming out of these frictions in the labor market, and who are the winners and losers, sort of what are the bad jobs and good jobs in this economy for following the shock. In terms of related literature, first of all, we introduced full transition dynamics in Helpman and Hoki 2010. That paper primarily focuses on comparing the long-run equilibria with frictional labor market. We're going to characterize analytically the transition following the trade shock and also add the wage rigidity on top of search and matching frictions. There is a lot of literature that discusses different aspects of trade liberalization and labor market dynamics. Some papers focus on sectoral reallocation or regional reallocation, and there are a lot of papers definitely who compare the steady states, the long-run equilibrium. But our focus here is to, first of all, think about firm heterogeneity within a sector and also focus on the transition dynamics. Compared to the papers that actually are focusing on similar patterns in the labor market that are coming out of the labor market frictions, we're going to focus on the transition adjustment following the trade shock. A brief preview of the results. So first of all, we're going to show that the dynamic adjustment takes a very long time. So that's going to be a lengthy transition due to those frictions and the labor market. And primarily, this lengthy transition is caused by the delayed exit of unproductive incumbents and the delayed entry in the market. This results in a gradual increase, so a slow increase in the trade flows, and also temporarily reduced productivity, some losses in efficiency there. We'll show that's a feature of the model that the consumer gains from trade are realized instantaneously, and they also don't depend on the labor market frictions. What we are going to really focus on is the short-run misallocation of employment and delayed exit. So again, as I mentioned, there is a delayed exit of unproductive firms, which results in the additional losses for the workers who are staying employed in those firms. Overall, labor market frictions, they result in the profit loss, destruction, and displacement of workers and low wages. But what we're emphasizing is, depending on which firms the workers are employed by prior to the shock, there is heterogeneity in sort of the losses that the workers are experiencing following the shock. Some of the jobs, in particular, in the workers employed by the large exporters, they don't really suffer any losses, as opposed to the workers employed by the firms eventually exiting the market or shrinking firms. They can either fire or face lower wages temporarily for lower wages. So overall, the role of labor market frictions in this economy is going to be to redistribute losses from workers to the firms. And we can also think about what are the aggregate implications of this, of this redistribution. Okay, so this is sort of the motivation and the preview of the results. Now let me introduce the model that we are working with. There are a lot of standard elements here. So we are thinking about two symmetric countries, two sectors with free entry. There is one homogeneous outside non-traded good, and then there is a differentiated traded sector with monopolistically competitive firms. There are going to be ex-ante homogeneous workers who are the only factor of production. The new input here is considering the labor market with symmetric frictions. In particular, those are going to be random social matching with no firing cost. The wages are determined through multilateral Nash wage bargaining, and we're also adding a downward rigidity on top of that. We're assuming that our unemployed workers are mobile across the sectors. And we're going to think about the transition following a standard unanticipated reduction in the bilateral trade cost. For the rest of the talk, the time is discrete with a relatively short time intervals. Okay, so this is the setup, pretty standard in some ways. Consumer demand, we're considering a consumer with quasi-linear utility, utility that depends on the amount of good Q0 of that non-traded sector, and then Q, aggregate Q, is the CS aggregator of all the differentiated traded varieties. This quasi-linear utility can be written in the following way, that it's an income, the nominal income, plus the consumer surplus part, which is characterized by the differentiated amount, the amount of the differentiated good. On the household labor supply side, we have a unit continuum of households with L workers, units of labor. Some part of those workers are employed by the differentiated traded sector, and then the rest are employed by the non-traded sector. The workers can be either employed or unemployed, and they meet with firms which results in the subject to the matching frictions, which results in the exogenous separation rate and the equilibrium job finding rate, X, the labor market tightness. Okay, so I'm gonna first talk about the non-traded sector a little bit, and then the most interesting part of the model, obviously, is what's happening in the differentiated traded sector. In the non-traded sector, in both sectors, and in fact, we have the constant return to scale a standard matching function, which results in the cost of a filing vacancy B, that is a function of the labor market tightness X. That's a standard assumption. And then in this sector, all the firms are single worker firms, and each worker producing one unit of output. We are making the following assumption, that there is enough workers, that the labor market is large enough so that along the equilibrium path, there is always some unemployment in the non-traded sector. So in this model, the non-traded sector sort of plays the role of a buffer, in a sense that we're assuming there is always enough unemployed workers in the sector that can reallocate to the traded sector in response to the shocks. And also, as a result of this assumption, we have the following lemma, which features two results. First, directly from this assumption, we can also pin down the unemployment value in the non-traded sector. And also, we can show that the labor market tightness and this and the cost of filling a vacancy are constant and stable throughout the transition. So this is the non-traded sector, and in the traded sector, there are some standard Melitz assumptions, which are the entrants are drawing productivity upon entry, and there is a fixed cost. the production technology is linear. H is the size of the firm, and so it's linear in the size of the firm. There is an export decision associated with the fixed cost of exporting, and then there is this pretty standard characterization of the optimal revenue of the firm that's coming from the domestic sales and the export. What's new here is that now the firms have to pay the cost of hiring workers, and this cost is B times H. So B is the cost of filling one vacancy. The cost of hiring H workers is proportional in the number of workers. There is the Nash bargaining that determines the wages, and what we have here is the Nash bargaining without commitment, which means that the additional value of one worker to the firm is the same as the value to the worker of getting employed. That results in some wage bargaining schedule that we characterize in the paper. And this is the bargaining without commitment. So every time there is a worker who exits the firm and there is no new employment, the firm renegotiates the wages with every worker. Then the firms die at the rate delta, and the matches are destroyed with the rate sigma. So there is an exogenous separation rate S that the worker is facing, which is the sum of the two. Okay. So as I mentioned, the firm is choosing how many workers to hire for the next period, H prime, given the current size and given their productivity level. There is a cost associated with that hiring decision, which is the hiring cost plus how many workers you are adding on top of those who do not separate through exogenous separation. This is... Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So there is a per period operating profit. That's the revenues minus the cost to the labor and the fixed cost of producing and exporting. Then there is this dynamic component, which is the cost of hiring. So you have 1 minus sigma workers who are left after the exogenous separation happened, and then you are adding H prime minus, so that those are the new workers that you have to hire, and then the total cost you are paying is B times that, the differential. And then there is a continuation value.
So you give the same wage every month, but that's a month.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So every time there is a change to the number of workers, the firm renegotiates, so all the workers within the firm get the same wage. Yeah. Yeah, thanks. So the optimal hiring policy resulting from this is therefore that, yeah.
So what is the intuition behind equilibrium unemployment? Is it the hiring cost that causes firm not to hire all the unemployed workers?
There is a, yeah, sure. There is a cost associated with hiring the workers, and how much workers the firm can hire depends on its productivity, depends on the exporting status. So there is this optimality condition.
In the sector,
yeah.
one workers for one firm, why wouldn't they employ all the unemployed workers?
There is still some entry, the free entry condition with the fixed cost. So there is a that determines how many vacancies are going to be. There is a cost associated with posting the vacancy. Yeah.
Okay, so
yeah, absolutely.
Cost and cost equilibrium unemployment rate.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. That's all coming through this search and matching frictions, the hiring cost. Yes, thanks. Okay, so the flow cost of hiring additional workers is equal to the marginal profit that the firm is getting out of there. So the result that we have here is that the labor market tightness, the cost of hiring an additional worker are constant, and we're going to assume symmetric market frictions, labor market frictions across the two sectors, and we get again a pretty standard unemployment, optimal unemployment decision for the firm here. What's important here is that this term phi basically summarizes all the labor market frictions. So it's a function of the cost of unemployment, cost of hiring, labor market tightness. So it summarizes the extent of the search and matching frictions in this economy. Okay, so this is the setup, and then we provide the characterization of this for the case of the when the minimum wage or the wage rigidity is binding in the steady state. But what we're going to focus on here today is the case where in the long run, the firms are not binded, not constrained by the minimum wage, but when the trade shock comes, some of the firms eventually are going to be constrained by this. So that's going to affect the transition. No, this is general for. Yeah. If the firm is small, then this term is going to change, right? There's going to be a change, for example, in the export status of the firm, and if it switches to exporting, yeah.
But if you're a young exporter, you have less hiring than, or you just jump.
If you're an exporter, then you're just adjust immediately. You hire additional workers. The lengthy transition is coming from the incumbents who are either shrinking or they're eventually exiting the market because they already paid some sunk cost of hiring workers. They can stay for a longer period of time that they should, in a sense.
Go straight to your target hiring.
Yeah. The big firms are going to immediately adjust their employment. Yep. Okay. So a couple things about the steady state, the long run equilibrium. The total welfare in this economy can be represented by the sum of the nominal income and the consumer surplus. And what we show, the model is designed in the way that the nominal wages, nominal income doesn't change before and after the trade shock. All the changes are coming from the consumer surplus changes, which is effectively the change in the price level. So the real income changes, but the nominal wages stay the same. Okay, so this is the steady state. This is the long-run equilibrium. Now I'm going to move to the transition dynamics. So we're going to consider a one-time unanticipated reduction, permanent reduction in the trade cost. And what we can show is true about this model is that along the transition, the amount of the differentiated good, QT, is going to be also larger or equal than the new steady state level. It's ensured by the free entry. Why is that important? It gives us the result here that the dynamic gains in the consumer surplus are going to be realized instantaneously when there is continuous entry. So when there is continuous entry, then this amount of differentiated good, and which represents consumer surplus, it just jumps immediately to the new steady state level and stays there. Where the changes throughout the transition are coming from is really this nominal income. It's going to change because of the decreased value of some of the firms, of the incumbent firms who are shrinking or exiting. It's going to change because of the change to the value of employment of the workers who are either staying within the firm and experience a decrease in wages, or the workers who are losing their employment and become unemployed. So this is going to be the focus of this transition path that we are describing. So all the aggregates, aggregate productivity, trade flows, employment, they're all going to depend on the extent of the labor market frictions and the distribution of the firm sizes. And in this model, there is this rich patterns of adjustment that we get out of this transition. So if I just close the bottom part of this graph, we just get a standard mallets where there is a cutoff for export. This is the productivity of the firms. Then there are some firms who are supplying to the domestic market and the firms who eventually exit because of the reduction, because of the trade shock. What we get on top of that, after adding this labor market frictions, we get that, well, a similar thing where some firms are exporting. Some firms are staying in the domestic market and supplying to the domestic market, but then there is a lot of heterogeneity across how firms exit. Again, the firms have already paid the cost of hiring the workers, and now they need to exit the market in the long run, but they might still stay in the short run and wait until the workers gradually separate, or some firms can choose to immediately fire some of their workers and then stay for some period until they eventually exit. So this delayed exit is something that's interesting and resulting out of the frictional market. Okay, and obviously we provide a full analytical characterization to this. Now I'm going to show us the results of some simulations with the reasonable parameters. So first, I want to show what happens to employment. Well, we have two panels here. The left panel is focusing on the large productivity. So we have here we have the exporters that increase their employment immediately upon the trade shock. And then we have some domestic suppliers that might decrease and shrink in response to the increasing competition. And as I mentioned, the adjustment for the exporters happens immediately, but the adjustment for the shrinking incumbents, it can take some time. So that's where the lengthy, that is happening along the transition path. And also, as I showed very briefly in the previous picture, there is heterogeneity in how the firms shrink or how the firms exit. I just want to mention that even for the exiting firms, there is still quite some heterogeneity in a sense, how many workers they decide to fire or how long they will wait until they eventually exit the market. We can also, with response to the aggregate summary of this transition patterns, we can be in different parameter regions where there is less entry, there is firing, or there is no firing. What I want to highlight here is for a reasonably large reduction in the trace cost, we're always going to be in the case with some entry. And for the very, very small trade shocks, you really need very small unemployment duration to achieve some entry. Otherwise, there's going to be no entry for some period and overshooting in the short run. So we are in the parameter space where we have some continuous entry upon the trade shock, and then we have this transition with heterogeneous for firms' outcomes. For the firm, so what happens with wages, right? We have this wage rigidity, which basically constrains how much the firm can drop the wages when the shock hits. So for a firm that eventually stays on the market and supplies to the domestic market, what happens to its wages? Well, there's some reduction on impact, and then while the firm is shrinking through the means of exogenous attrition, this wages, they slowly rise to the new steady state level. What the wage rigidity does here, it restricts the firm in how much they can decrease these wages upon the shock. And again, for the firm that's staying on the market, it's going to take the same time, but with higher wages that, again, takes some of the losses away from the workers and puts it on the firm. Then it goes back to the steady state. For the firing, for the firms that are eventually exiting the market, they can choose to fire some workers, which means that the workers are going to just become unemployed and their income drops altogether to unemployment benefits. But some workers can still stay employed for some period with still declining wages before the firm exits and before the workers become unemployed. So here we show what happens to the workers' income and unemployment as a comparative statistics with respect to the unemployment duration and the minimum wage, which is summarizing the wage rigidity. So what's happening when we increase the unemployment duration? So first of all, when there's no labor market frictions, that what we get here, there's no income losses. A lot of workers get fired, but they immediately get reemployed. That's why we don't have losses. All the workers who are going to be eventually reemployed, that happens immediately. As we increase the unemployment duration, or sort of the extent of the labor market frictions, what's happening? Well, there is less workers who are fired on impact. There is more and more workers who are staying temporarily with the firm and eventually get fired. But they experience income loss, either coming from a decreased wages or eventually they're becoming unemployed. But yeah, so there is less and less people who are fired on impact, and eventually when the labor market frictions are high enough, we just have no one fired on impact, but there is still dynamics, there is still change in the cumulative income losses of those workers. So then what happens when we change the extent of the wage rigidity, or we change the minimum wage here? Well, at some point, when it's very small, nothing happens, it's not binding. The firms want to decrease wages, but not too much, so they're not constrained. At some point, this minimum wage is becoming binding, so the firms who want to decrease the wages, they're constrained in a sense, and what they do, when this minimum wage becomes high enough, they start firing on impact, right? So then the firms who would otherwise stay, shrink gradually, and then exit, they would first fire some workers, choose to fire some workers, and then they would still stay for some period of time. What that does to the workers' income loss, obviously it decreases the income loss as the wages that the firms are setting have to be higher. But that really pushes the unemployment rate up. Okay, so to highlight the length of this transition, to highlight what's happening with the time, I'm going to show the aggregate productivity dynamics here. First of all, what I want to highlight is that this full transition back to the steady state can take up to 4 years in our simulation. What's happening along this transition is first we have a decline in the aggregate productivity on impact, and it stays low up until this point where the firms who are eventually staying in the market are shrinking to their optimal employment. So this is really, so this picture, it shows sort of the intensive margin where in the short run we have the firms who are large enough, and that results in the losses in productivity. Here, once those firms shrink to their optimal employment, what we have is really we have too many firms that are still not exiting the market. So that's the delayed exit that I was talking about before that, and that delayed exit takes quite a while before all the unproductive incumbents eventually exit and the new entrants can come in. Okay. So this is the transition, and then what the wage rigidity does to this transition, it's sort of pushes the unproductive firms to exit faster, and it pushes some of the staying firms to also shrink faster by firing some workers. So what happens if I put the rigid wages on top of that, both all of this timestamps that are going to shift slightly to the left. So there's going to be both firing by the staying firms, firing by the exiting firms, and faster exit. Okay. So finally, moving to sort of summarizing this into the gains from trade and decomposing it by, into changes for the workers and the firms. So how we can summarize the dynamic gains from trade here, we can decompose it into the changes in consumer surplus, right, which, as we discussed, are instantaneous. They happen right after the shock. And then we can also decompose it into the changes in the workers' income or the workers' value and the changes in the firm's profit. So those two components are going to be dynamic. And again, I'm going to do the same exercise. I'm going to show how this aggregate dynamic changes and its components change when I change the extent of the labor market frictions, the unemployment duration, and the minimum wage, the wage rigidity. So on both pictures, what we have the gains from consumer surplus that are realized instantaneously, stay the same. They don't depend on the labor market frictions, right? So they stay the same. Now here, when we change the unemployment duration, what happens? So we have the worker income loss, which is everything between this black line and the dashed orange line. We have the firm profit, which is everything between the orange line and the blue line. And then sort of the blue line represents the full gains from trade. So what we have with the increasing unemployment duration, the full gains from trade, they decline. That's the first thing. What also happens, you can see that the worker income loss, it shrinks with the time, not with the time, but with the extent of the labor market frictions, and then the firm profit loss increases. So there is this redistribution from the workers to the firms. The searching matching frictions, what they do, they insure workers against unemployment. They make it much more difficult for the firms to fire workers. So here, at some point, those frictions are going to be large enough, so there is not going to be any firing. No one is going to be fired, but then the firms are going to suffer a larger profit loss. If we think about this loss of income that's coming from firing, right, you can see here that at some point it just goes to zero, and then all of the income loss is coming from the workers who are staying employed within the firm. What happens when we change the extent of the wage rigidity? Again, we have the full gains from trade that can at some point start increasing overall. There is still this redistribution from the workers to the firms, so the worker income loss is shrinking, and the firm profit loss is increasing slightly. What's happening, again, while the minimum wage is lower enough, it's not binding, so it doesn't affect the aggregate gains and the decomposition. Once it becomes binding, what it does, it makes for the firms, it actually pushes the firms to fire more workers and exit faster. So we have the workers who are staying employed, their income losses are decreasing because of the minimum wage constraint. For the firms, the profit are increasing. But what we have here is that the full gains from trade are increasing. So in some sense, what we are starting from the economy which is not efficient, which has some certain matching frictions present. And as the shock hits what the minimum wage ensures, it speeds up the delayed exit. That was one of the reasons for inefficiency along the transition. So what the wage rigidity effectively does, it reduces this inefficiency. It pushes the firm out of the market, it speeds up reallocation, and it also leads to less losses along the transition for that reason. Okay, how much time do I have? I think I have the last slide.
You still have
10
10 minutes.
minutes.
But
Yeah. Let me see. Yeah, I guess I will conclude here. So what we have showed you today is that trade liberalization with a frictional labor market can result in a lengthy transition. The main reason for the lengthy transition is that we have firms who are staying because they've hired too many workers, paid the cost for that, and it's optimal for them to stay and keep some of the workers employed before they exit. So that delayed exit, it results in misallocation of labor. The workers who would otherwise separate from the firm and get re-employed, they get stuck with those firms that also decrease the wages and only can get re-employed after some time. What also happens throughout this transition is that the trade flows are staying lower than the long run volume. So it's slowly, this transition is characterized by a slow increase in the trade flows and the period of decreased productivity. It also results in the heterogeneity across workers' outcomes that depends on the firm's outcomes. So we have the good jobs, which are essentially the jobs at the exporting firms, right? Those are the firms that either increase immediately or some of the firms become exporters after the trade shocks. And the workers employed by those firms don't experience any losses, they stay employed. And then there are bad jobs for the workers employed by the shrinking firms or the exiting firms, and sort of there is a heterogeneity in the extent to which those jobs are bad. Some of the workers get immediately unemployed, some of the workers still stay employed for some time and experience the income losses. So that being said, again, there are a lot of strong assumptions that we have here. Linear hiring cost, or there is no frictions on the entry margin, but those assumptions allow us to really neatly characterize analytically what's happening along this transition and that, analyze that heterogeneity in the firm's outcomes. Okay, I guess I'll conclude here then. Thank you.
Discussion by Aaron. So you can take up to 20 minutes, I guess.
No, I won't be. It's Control L. Yes. Okay, thank you very much. So I really enjoyed this paper. Gave me a lot of new insights, and it was very good. It's a very well executed applied theory paper with some quantification. And this is obvious. I don't need to say that this is one of my favorite topics, and it's an extremely important and policy relevant topic. And I successfully predicted that Katya will do a great job, so I skipped the summary and all this usual stuff. And I'll have 3 general suggestions and some minor complaints about the notation and that type of stuff. Okay, so I'm kind of interested in photography. And in photography, the rule is for a great photograph, you have to decide what to leave out. So it's not about what to include, but what to leave out. So my first comment is about that. So I'm going to complain about something, but with a warning that it should not be pushed too much. And that's the quantification. So I think, so my humble view that the papers, like model-based papers, should be about mechanisms, like how these things work and what causes what. So Katya just showed us many figures, but she did not show us any tables, which was great, I think, so that we can understand how the model works. So the quantification, however, it's not super clear whether it is US or EU, and what are the parameters. The parameters are clear and they are all reasonable, but we cannot really think of this model. Okay, so this is the US and that's what will happen in the US. So then maybe it's better to have better quantification and more serious, but with a caveat. So what is the optimal level of quantification in a trade model? So I have prepared a chart for you that the levels of quantification in trade models. So you start with a pure theory, level 0, applied theory with example numbers, and then quantified applied theory, this paper. You can go a bit further, like maybe structural estimation with some quantification. That's my preference, and maybe a bit more serious quantification would be good. But if you keep going in this direction, you lose the fact that Katya showed us some figures, right? So you become untractable. And I think our preferences should be kind of lexicographical. Once you start losing out this nice tractability, then you are going in the wrong direction. So I think when you push the models, you end up with some completely crazy stuff rather than the matrix, which simulates the world, right? So I think a bit quantification, a bit more serious would be better, but not too much. So that's my opinion. And second, so when I was reading the paper, there's one thing that kind of did not bother me, but it confused me, is that they put, the authors put the bargaining power of the workers as 1/2, right? And then it disappears from the equations. And then, oh, this is the big news. The wage rigidity increases welfare. Then, oh, of course, it increases welfare because you guys set the parameters such that the Hosios rule is broken, right? So, okay, Hosios rule is broken, so that's a distortion. So if you if you put one more distortion, maybe it's balancing, right? So just I had to remember the Hosios rule and stuff like that. So the idea is that the gains of the searcher, when I start searching for a job, the utility increase, the welfare increase in the society should match my welfare increase, because otherwise it will get broken. So when I start searching, this is my bargaining power. This is the surplus firm plus the worker, and this is the probability that I will find a match. So that's my expected surplus, and that should be increased to the surplus and the derivative of how many matches I generate by searching. So these should equalize, and then you can just put this thing over here, and then this becomes an elasticity that's already my bargaining power. So the bargaining power is equal to the elasticity of matches respect to unemployment. Then this is the Hosios rule. And of course it's broken. No, it's not broken. They have 1/2, and the elasticity, which also confused me because they show the relative elasticity, not the elasticity of matching to unemployment. There's nothing here. So it is, but then because the model is so sophisticated, it kind of breaks the rule, the applicability of the rule. And then my question is, okay, so this wage rigidity increases efficiency in the model, and how? So that I could not see in the paper. So if you could just play with some of the parameters and figure out two things, one, how this is broken, how this increases welfare. Second, and then, so is it a result that you would expect for different parameterization? So let's say that this is not EU, this is Colombia, and will it be still relevant? So for which space of it might be difficult exercise because I don't know how long it takes to solve the model, but depending on how long it's solved, maybe shedding some light on this could be preferable. And then what do we have in the literature? We have this whole paper that's showing, that's a very famous paper by Ayar, I think, that wage rigidities can explain unemployment dynamics better because it increases the responsiveness of the model to shocks. And then, I think this is like very interesting that the wage rigidities increase the welfare. Scheimer has also a paper, that's a very short paper. I think that's not as well known as his other papers maybe, but he shows that there's a small amount of decrease in the welfare, but he has this extreme rigidity, like fixed wage. So I don't know how it will be. So maybe it's not the correct way to compare these two because different types of rigidities, but it is like almost negligible decline in the welfare. So if you could maybe talk about these papers, you could connect, because I think macroeconomists will be also very interested in this result. Okay, my last, this is not a suggestion or a complaint, but this is some observation. So many years ago, I was working on these models like somewhat similar with John McLaren, and then I gave up, and then it's like sitting there like for maybe 15 years or so. And the thing that surprised me when we were working, so we realized that things happen very fast. Like 1 year, it was exactly like that. So the search and match models, when you add dynamics, it's very quick. So another graph, very quick, right? So maybe it takes a while, but like you get very close to the steady state. And this is an example with a dynamic discrete choice model. Actually, it's my dissertation chapter published in GAE, my very first publication. And Jonathan Eaton it's a long time ago, was the editor. So here is the transition. Okay, this is less than a year. I don't believe this. This is like 20 years almost, so I don't believe it either. So maybe there is a way to kind of find something in between so that it is not like in these extremes. Yeah, so that's just one observation. And then I have some complaints about like notation and stuff like that. Maybe I can just share the slide so it's not nothing like, you have like how many thetas, like what is the optimal number of thetas in a paper? So I think this is like too much, like it's a bit fewer than this, would be better. And then you have these like next period maximum and the time index. Also one thing is that when macro papers just skip the time index, it's kind of like for me, it's a bit difficult. Is it changing? Is it a variable parameter? Is it changing or what's happening? So maybe those could be better and some other even more minor stuff. Okay, thank you very much.
You can use this one, right?
Yeah, perfect.
So we first respond and then we take some more questions, right? That's the plan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unless you want to collect questions before, it's up to you.
Well, let me thank Erhan. These were great comments. I'm very sympathetic with a lot of them. But I wanted to emphasize 3 things quickly. One is it's a super stylized model. That's why it's not calibrated to either EU or US. We wanted to kind of show the richness of patterns that come out of it. So one thing to keep in mind, it's a trade shock that's really positive here, right? It's really good. It's an increase in long-run productivity. Typically, in the Melitz model, what happens? A bunch of people gets unemployed right away, and they get relocated very fast, and so there is no income loss. So there is nothing bad about unemployment in the Melitz model. It's really instantaneous, right? And so what we're trying to do here is open up that black box of unemployment and like kind of spread it in time through the search frictions. And so what you see happening is that, well, it's a positive aggregate shock, but it could be a negative shock for the majority of firms. And that's true in any Melitz model. That's a negative shock for the majority of firms. And just some firms that benefit from it. But there is no labor market consequences of the fact that it's a bad shock for the majority of firms. With labor market frictions, all the workers are still the same ex ante. But once they're connected to a firm, the fact that it's a negative shock for the majority of firms, it becomes a negative shock for a large number of workers, right? Again, the big firms that benefit from trade, they employ a lot of people because these are the large firms. So it's bad news for the majority of firms. It doesn't have to be a bad news for the majority of workers, right? Because it's good news for a few firms, but they're very, very large, right? And so we're trying to sort of spell all of it out, but we keep in a very stylized model where, for example, on aggregate, that's still a positive shock. So what's missing, for example, is some sectors and regions need to shrink, right? And we actually don't analyze that at all because the number of cutoffs that you show, it already shows you once you're trying to sort out exactly what happens during the transition for workers, you need to have those 20 cutoffs, right? Because there are these very different regimes for what different firms will do. And it's a single shock, which is a positive aggregate shock, but through firm heterogeneity, it creates this very heterogeneous paths for firms and workers. And that's why you need all those cutoffs. I'm taking a lot of time, but one thing, so it turns out this model is very tricky. We have a paper where we analyze the efficiency properties in steady state, and the Hosius condition is not enough. And the problem is that there is bargaining with a lot of workers, and that creates, it's sort of like Stolen-Zwiebel, and Guido Menzio corrected that maybe it shouldn't be called Stolen-Zwiebel, or I don't want to get into that debate, but it's a multilateral bargain with a lot of workers, and the firm gets incentive to overhire, to push down the wages. So what happens here, it's not just that there is a Hosius condition on how many people you hire, but in the process of bargaining, you overhire, and that's one of the frictions here, and there are monopoly markups, and all of this interacts. And it turns out that you can get to the efficient allocations in steady state, but the Hosius condition doesn't ensure it, and so it's a highly inefficient model to begin with, and the transition is inefficient on top of it. So I'm very sympathetic to a question, what would have been the sort of the optimal thing, but it turns out to be extremely hard to characterize. And so what we show is once you hit this model that to begin with is fairly inefficient, with an unexpected trade shock where a lot of the hiring decisions they're sunk before, and given the trade shock, firms end up with too many workers, right? And so they need to shed those workers over time. And it turns out that having, for example, downward wage rigidity helps the firms to shed workers faster, which is good for the aggregate allocation. It might be bad for individual workers and individual firms facing those rigidities. But for aggregate allocations, it's good because it helps the aggregate transition to happen faster. And the last thing on the speed of transition, the labor market frictions, this is the point in a lot of the Diamond Mortz and Pissarides models. The transitions are super fast there. What makes transition somewhat slow here is that it's the interaction of firm exit and labor market friction. So labor market frictions keep the inefficient firms there for longer, and that's what makes the transition long, right? Otherwise, pure labor market transitions are very fast. But what really happens is that firms hang on to workers and workers hang on to firms for far too long from the aggregate perspective, and that prevents the entry of new, more efficient firms in. Right? This is the sort of efficient response bilaterally for firms and workers, but the aggregate transitions get less efficient from that. So I took way too much time, but these were my observations here.
Thanks. Thanks. Yeah. Okay. Just a quick question. So I was wondering about this part of the model where the exporters adjust immediately and grow, right? So you could think that in response to the shock, just as firms adjust slowly downwards, it's also hard for them to adjust upwards, and that would slow down the response of aggregate exports, but it would have different, I think, implications for different distributional consequences, because that part of the market, there's upward pressure on wages because they can't hire fast enough.
Questions? Okay.
Maybe do you want to answer this?
We can collect and then see.
Okay, because I have a clarification and then a question.
Oh.
Okay. So you go, answer this and then we can put that.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's very important. That's very reasonable. What we have here is we don't have that. We sort of don't have, for example, constraint on the labor supply side that makes it harder for the firms to hire the workers. So that what makes the expansion being immediate. Otherwise, I think introducing some frictions on the reallocation of the workers or across the sectors, for example, that would make it. That would lead to those consequences. And I would say probably, again, the reason why we don't do this is that would add a lot more things on top of what we already have to analyze. But obviously there's a question of how much is lost there versus how much is lost from the shrinking firms.
Yeah, let me add one thing quickly here. So one thing that there is no convexity in expansion, on two dimensions. One is that the idea is if you can double the vacancies, you'll double the number of workers that you attract, so there is no convexity there. And I think this is realistic at the level of a country, probably unrealistic at the level of smaller geographies. But I think what's much more binding is there is this thing that entry of firms can be instantaneous as well, right? And so if you think the important asymmetry is that you can kill the productivity draw quickly and exit, but creating a new productivity draw takes a while. This is what we don't have here. And I think this is a super interesting one. You know that trade shock is positive, but you need to create new productivity draws for that. And if that takes time, you can have, you know, the downward thing happen faster and the upward thing happen slow. And so I think this is an interesting thing to add quantitatively. But then you lose all the tractability of free entry. Free entry buys you a lot of stuff. And if you think that entry is slow for convexity reasons, then you really have to go quantitative.
Yeah, I want to ask, just to clarify mechanisms of the model, then maybe I can ask a follow-up suggestion. So it seems what you have to have it like very tractable is this linearity of cost to hire, right? And that's very neat because then you get the instantaneous and then you can, you know, then I guess what's important there is that you don't have career considerations in the weights, because then the workers would have to think of what happens in the weights. So I'm not saying like this should be part of your paper, non-linear cost, but I wonder what happens if you add some non-linearities and if there's some special case you can solve for them, and it could be interesting, because then then the worker could choose, like I think it's related to what Erhan was saying, a worker could choose a firm with the lower weights because they would expect they will grow faster as they grow, you know, it takes a while to grow and so on.
Let me just very quickly answer that. It's a bit of a Russian, we're two Russians here, it's a bit of a Russian doll that you need all these assumptions to actually make it work analytically. And we wanted an analytical thing to understand all of the things that are happening. And so it turns out the linear entry and linear hiring allows you to make use of the free entry condition. Without that free entry condition, wouldn't you bind very much analytically? But here the goal was to get the free entry of firms, which required the jump of the entering firms to the new steady state if they were getting there slower, right? And so then you're completely right. We're not focusing on the good stuff that happens to workers, the career ladder. We're focusing on the bad stuff that happens to those who are stuck in the firms that need to shrink and how their wages fall. And we can do that analytically part, right? Obviously, it's super interesting to know what would happen in models where the growth expansion happens slowly and you have the career ladders, but this is like way much more difficult than what we've been doing here.
I really like the. Oh.
Okay, fine. When I'm thinking about labor market frictions and rigidities, surely wage rigidities are one of them, but I'm also thinking about firing costs, like especially if you're making the comparison between Europe and US or different industries that are unionized or not. So the firing costs would be kind of going in the opposite direction, right? So I wonder about this comparison. And in general, I think more general point is that it would be nice to think about like you have implications for heterogeneity across industries in terms of how rigid they are. Well, countries, of course, but it's even harder to identify, I guess. So maybe you could tell like, is there evidence that goes in that direction that in fact these rigidities or firing costs or something across different markets, whether it's a location, geography, or it's an industry that goes in the direction that your model would predict in terms of the speed of transition and relocation?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we don't have the firing cost. I guess we can extend it very easily to the linear firing cost, and then it would be all the same. As soon as we add some convexity on the firing cost, that would be an additional force opposing the wage rigidity. So it would be an additional force that makes it harder to fire workers and would make the firms to stay longer. But yeah, that would act in the same sort of direction, at least as the social matching frictions and the hiring frictions that we have.
Yeah, so we were making a choice of where to go, downward wage rigidity or firing costs. In principle, can do both. It's an SS rule, right? And so what the minimum wage does, it actually shrinks the lower bound of the SS rule. So more firms would choose to fire, right? The firing costs, as you're saying, would actually expand the SS rule. And it's interesting which one wins, right? And in different markets, it's kind of interesting whether, you know, if you think of a very frictional market, which has both the minimum wage and the firing cost, which one actually wins in moving the the lower bound of the inaction region. Conceptually, it's sort of all in there. This SS bound is there, and it's just about characterizing how the lower bound of the SS bound will move. Yeah.
Thank you. I really like the paper. I like the model. Can I add a little wrinkle, given that you guys are so smart? How about include investment in the decisions? And workers hiring and firing, firms whether hire or fire workers depends on whether they have existing investment. And to add to that, large firms invest more than smaller firms. So your entry, exit of smaller firms do not impact the investment decision of smaller firms, do not impact that. But the large firm, the incumbent successful exporter who has invested a lot, will they be able to respond to labor market adjustment because of trade liberalization, because of the fixed investment or potential investment down the road that they may undertake? So think about that.
Yeah. No, I mean, if the capital market is frictionless, it's kind of in there, right? You need to expand and you just buy all the inputs that you want in the frictionless market. So that part would be straightforward. But really doing the labor market frictional and investment frictional, that would be quite, I'm not quite sure we're smart enough for that. But yeah, like, I mean, obviously the larger firms need to expand on employment and on investment. And then you kind of wonder in which one is the more constraining feature, right? So we focused on the employment side and actually made it linear. So.
Okay, so if no further questions, then thank you very much.